It was March 4th, 1990, a Sunday. The kind of late winter evening when the cold didn't announce itself with snow or wind, but with stillness, a damp, penetrating quiet that settled into your bones and stayed there. Barrow Point, Maine, population 3,200, sat where the mainland met the restless edge of the Atlantic. It was a town of weathered clapboard houses, salt-worn docks, and people who had learned long ago not to ask too many questions about what happened beyond the fog line. In March, the ocean was still dark and angry, and the sky seemed pressed low, like a lid over something better left unopened. Daniel Francis Mercer was 37 years old that year. He taught English at Barrow Point High School, a brick building perched on a hill overlooking the harbor, its windows perpetually streaked with salt spray. He had been teaching there for 11 years. The students liked him, not in the casual way they tolerated most teachers, but genuinely. He assigned Steinbeck and Hemingway, but he also let them write about their own lives, their fishing family, their dying town, their fears about leaving or staying. He listened. That was rare. Mercer was tall, lean, with graying hair he kept a little too long, and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the look of someone perpetually reading something just out of view. He wore corduroy blazers with elbow patches, drank black coffee, and drove a blue 1984 Ford Escort that rattled on cold morning. He lived alone in a small rental cottage on Harmon Street, 3 blocks from the school. No wife, no children. A few friends, but not many close ones. By all accounts, he was content. That Sunday evening, Mercer walked into Carter's diner at around 6:15. Carter's sat on Main Street, across from the old post office and the gas station that closed every Sunday at 5. It was the kind of place where the coffee was always hot, the booths were cracked vinyl, and the waitstaff knew your order before you said it. Linda Ray Porter was working that night. She had been waitressing at Carter's for 12 years, long enough to know everyone in town, and long enough to notice when something felt off. He came in quiet, she would tell police later. Not upset, not nervous, just ... different, like he'd made up his mind about something. Mercer ordered decaf, black, and a slice of blueberry pie he barely touched. He sat in the corner booth, the one by the window overlooking the street. In front of him, spread across the table, were paper student essays, marked up in red pen. He worked methodically, sipping his coffee, occasionally glancing out at the street, where the fog was already beginning to roll in from the harbor. Linda refilled his cup twice. The second time, around 7:30, he looked up at her and said something she would remember for the rest of her life. "I'm finally ready to tell the truth about something." She asked him what he meant. He smiled, tired, almost apologetic. Smiled and said, "Nothing. Just talking to myself." Then he paid his bill, left a generous tip, and walked out into the cold. The temperature that night was 32 degrees. The fog had thickened, rolling through town in slow, heavy waves. Street lamps glowed faintly through the mist, casting everything in a pale, ghostly light. The wind carried the smell of salt and kelp, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Mercer climbed into his Ford Escort and drove north. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. The car was found the next morning at Gull's Head, a rocky outcrop, about 4 miles north of town, where the cliffs dropped 60 feet into the churning Atlantic. It was a place locals avoided at night. The road leading up to it was narrow, winding through dense pine forest, and there were no houses, no lights, nothing but trees, and the sound of waves breaking against stone. The Ford Escort was parked neatly in the small gravel lot at the edge of the cliffs. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver's side door was unlocked. On the passenger seat was a stack of student papers, the same ones Mercer had been grading at Carter's. A thermos of coffee sat in the cup holder, still half full. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no footprints leading away from the car. The fog had lifted by then, and the morning was cold and bright. A jogger named Garrett Hines had spotted the vehicle around 7:30 while running the coastal trail. At first he thought nothing of it. People sometimes parked there to watch the sunrise. But when he passed by again on his way back an hour later, and the car was still there, engine cold, he called the police. Officer Tom Bellamy arrived within 20 minutes. He recognized the car immediately. Everyone in Barrow Point knew Daniel Mercer's blue Escorted was the only one in town, and it made a distinctive rattling sound when it idled. Bellamy approached cautiously. He knocked on the window. No response. He opened the door and looked inside. The interior smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. The registration in the glove box confirmed what he already knew. The car belonged to Daniel Francis Mercer. 22 Harmon Street, Barrow Point. Bellamy radioed for backup and began searching the area. He walked to the edge of the cliffs and looked down. The rocks below were jagged and wet, slick with seaweed and foam. The tide was high, the water dark and violent. If someone had gone over, there was no way to see them from above. Within an hour, a full search team had assembled. Sheriff Arnold Decker coordinated the effort. 12 officers, a handful of volunteers, and 2 tracking dogs brought in from the next county. They combed the cliffs, the woods, the beach below. They called Mercer's name until their voices went hoarse. They found nothing. By Monday afternoon, word had spread through Barrow Point like smoke. The high school closed early. Students clustered in small groups on street corners, speaking in hushed voices. Parents kept their children inside. The local radio station ran the story every hour. Asterisk, teacher missing search underway at Gull's Head. Asterisk, at Barrow Point High, the faculty gathered in the teacher's lounge, a cramped room that smelled of burnt coffee and cheap air freshener. Principal Evelyn Cross stood at the front, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She was a stern woman in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, and a reputation for running the school like a ship, orderly, efficient, and unforgiving of nonsense. "I want to be clear," she said, her voice clipped. "We do not know what happened. The police are investigating. In the meantime, we will conduct ourselves with professionalism and composure. If students ask questions, refer them to their counselors. Do not speculate." But speculation had already begun. Raymond Dole, the school janitor, sat in the back of the room with his arms crossed. He was a wiry man in his 50s, with calloused hands and a face that looked perpetually sunburned. He had worked at the school for nearly 20 years, longer than most of the teachers. He kept to himself, did his job, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. But that day, as the meeting ended and the teachers filed out, Dole approached Sheriff Decker, who had come to the school to ask questions. "I need to tell you something," Dole said quietly. Decker led him into an empty classroom and closed the door. "What is it?" Dole hesitated, then said, "About 2 weeks ago, I was locking up the gym after hours. It was late around 9, maybe 9:30. I heard voices coming from inside, shouting. I went to check, and I saw Mercer in there with someone. A man. I didn't see his face, but they were arguing. About what? I don't make out the words. But Mercer looked upset. Real upset. The other guy, whoever he was pointing his finger at Mercer, like he was accusing him of something. I left before they saw me. Didn't want to get involved. Why didn't you report this before? Dole shrugged. Didn't seem like my business. Decker made a note and thanked him. But the detail gnawed at him. Who had Mercer been arguing with, and why? By Tuesday, the search had expanded. Divers from the State Police Marine Unit arrived to scour the waters below Gull's Head. Helicopters flew low over the cliffs, scanning for any sign of a body. Volunteers walked the shoreline for miles in both directions, checking tide pools and rocky inlets. Still, nothing. The local newspaper, asterisk, the Barrow Point Beacon, asterisk, ran a front-page story on Wednesday. Asterisk, teacher vanishes without a trace, community in shock. Asterisk. The article included a photo of Mercer from the school yearbook, smiling faintly beneath the caption. Asterisk, teacher of the year, 1989. Asterisk, neighbors on Harmon Street were interviewed. They described Mercer as quiet, polite, a man who kept to himself but was always friendly when spoken to. Mrs. Abigail Fletcher, who lived next door, said she had seen him leave his house on Sunday evening, around 6 o'clock. He was carrying a briefcase, she said. He always did, even on weekends. I waved to him, and he waved back. That was the last time I saw him. Police searched Mercer's cottage. It was small, one-bedroom, a cramped kitchen, a living room lined with bookshelves. Everything was neat, orderly, dishes washed and stacked, bed made, bills paid and filed. On his desk, they found lesson plans for the following week, already prepared. On his nightstand, a book, asterisk, The Great Gatsby, asterisk, with a bookmark halfway through. There was no note, no journal, no indication that anything was wrong. But in the closet, Sheriff Decker found something that gave him pause. A cardboard box filled with old newspaper clippings, photocopies of police reports, and handwritten notes. The clippings were yellowed, dated between 1962 and 1967. They all related to a single incident. The disappearance of a local fisherman named Samuel Briggs, who had vanished from his boat in 1964 and was never found. Decker flipped through the notes. Mercer's handwriting was small, precise. He had underlined certain names, circled dates, drawn arrows connecting different pieces of information. At the bottom of one page, in red ink, Mercer had written, asterisk, they knew. They all knew. Asterisk. Decker bagged the box as evidence and made a note to follow up. But the lead felt cold, distant, something from another time, another story. What did it have to do with Daniel Mercer? On Thursday morning, a woman named Anita McLean called the sheriff's office. She was 26 years old, a former student of Mercer's, who had graduated from Barrow Point High in 1982. She now worked as a paralegal in Portland, but she had driven back to town when she heard the news. I need to talk to someone, she said, about Mr. Mercer. Sheriff Decker met with her that afternoon at the station. Anita was nervous, her hands twisting a paper cup of coffee she didn't drink. I don't know if this matters, she began, but Mr. Mercer was working on something, a project. He didn't talk about it much, but I know he was researching an old disappearance, something from the 60s. A fisherman, I think. He told me once that he thought there was more to the story than what people said. Did he say what he found? No, but he seemed ... intense about it, like it mattered to him. He went to the Historical Society a few times that winter. I know because I saw him there once when I was visiting my parents over Christmas. He was looking through old records. Decker thanked her and made another note. Later that day, he drove to the Barrow Point Historical Society, a small building on Elm Street that doubled as a library and archive. The director, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Hale, confirmed that Mercer had visited twice, once in January, once in February. He was looking at records from the 1960s, she said. Specifically, anything related to the fishing industry and missing person. I remember because he was very thorough. Spent hours going through the files. Do you keep a visitor log? We do. She brought out a leather-bound book and flipped through the pages. Decker scanned the entries. There were dozens of named students, researchers, genealogists, but Mercer's name was not among them. That's odd, Margaret said, frowning. I'm sure he signed in. I remember seeing him write his name. Decker felt a chill. Someone had removed Mercer's entries. But who, and why? By the end of the week, the search was scaled back. The official conclusion, according to Sheriff Decker, was that Mercer had likely gone to Gull's Head that night, to think, perhaps to walk, perhaps to sit by the cliffsand had somehow fallen. The fog, the darkness, the uneven terrain, ... Accidents happened. But there was no body, no evidence, just a car and questions. At Barrow Point High, students returned to their routines. Mercer's classroom was locked. A substitute teacher took over his classes. The yearbook committee decided to dedicate that year's edition to him, with a full-page photo and the inscription, asterisk, a teacher who made us think. A man who listened. But among the students, a different story was taking shape. Some said Mercer had uncovered something dangerous, something the town didn't want known. Others whispered that he had staged his own disappearance, that he was still out there, somewhere, living under a new name. Late at night, when the fog rolled in from the ocean and the wind howled through the pines, people in Barrow Point locked their doors a little tighter. They looked out at the dark waters and wondered, what had Daniel Mercer been ready to tell that night at Carter's Diner? And why had he never come back? Spring came to Barrow Point the way it always did, slowly, reluctantly, as if the town itself resisted change. The ice melted from the harbor. The wind shifted from bitter to merely cold. Fishing boats that had sat dormant all winter were scraped, painted, and returned to the water. Life moved forward, because it had to. But Daniel Mercer did not come back. By April, the search had been officially suspended. Sheriff Decker filed his final report with the state police, marking the case as an unexplained disappearance with a presumed accidental drowning. The Coast Guard had combed the coastline for weeks. Nothing washed ashore. No clothing, no shoes, no wallet. The ocean, it seemed, had taken him completely. Mercer's Ford Escort was impounded, processed for evidence, and eventually released to his only living relative, a younger sister named Claire, who lived in Massachusetts. She drove up to Barrow Point in late April to collect his belongings from the cottage on Harmon Street. She was a quiet woman, with Daniel's same grey eyes, and she moved through his small rooms with the careful silence of someone trying not to disturb a grave. She packed his books into cardboard boxes. She folded his clothes and donated them to the church. She sorted through papers, photographs, letters, fragments of a life that felt incomplete, unfinished. In the closet, she found the box of research materials about Samuel Briggs, the fisherman who had disappeared in 1964. She stared at it for a long time, then closed the lid and took it with her when she left. No one in Barrow Point saw Claire Mercer again. At Barrow Point High, the substitute teacher who had taken over Mercer's classes became permanent. Her name was Mrs. Calloway, and she was older, stricter, less interested in her students' personal lives. She assigned the classics and graded by the rubric. The students did their work and said nothing. But in the hallways, Mercer's absence lingered like a shadow. His former student seniors, who had been with him for 3 years, graduated that June with a strange, hollow feeling. At the ceremony, Principal Evelyn Cross gave a brief speech acknowledging Mercer's contributions to the school. Her words were formal, measured, devoid of emotion. "We honor the memory of a dedicated educator," she said, "and we hope that, in time, answers will come." But no one believed that anymore. The summer of 1990 was hot and dry. The town's annual lobster festival went on as planned, though attendance was lower than usual. Tourists came and went, unaware of the story that had gripped the town just months before. By August, the local newspaper had stopped running updates. There was nothing new to report. Daniel Mercer had simply vanished, and the world had moved on. But for some, the questions refused to fade. Linda Ray Porter, the waitress from Carter's Diner, found herself replaying that last conversation over and over. Asterisk, "I'm finally ready to tell the truth about something." Asterisk, what truth? And why had he looked so resigned, so tired, when he said it? She mentioned it to her husband one evening while they were washing dishes. He shrugged and said, "People say strange things when they're stressed." Maybe he was just thinking out loud. But Linda didn't believe that. She had seen hundreds of people pass through Carter's over the years, lonely people, troubled people, people on the edge of something they couldn't name. Mercer hadn't looked troubled. He had looked resolved. She thought about calling Sheriff Decker to tell him this. But what would she say? That she had a feeling, that something about Mercer's tone had bothered her. It wasn't evidence. It was just instinct. So she said nothing, and the memory stayed with her like a splinter she couldn't remove. Raymond Dole, the school janitor, also carried the weight of that night. He had told Sheriff Decker about the argument he had witnessed in the Jim Mercer, and an unknown man, shouting, pointing fingers. But Decker had never followed up, or if he had, Dole never heard about it. In the months that followed, Dole found himself watching people more carefully. He studied faces in the hallways, at the grocery store, at the gas station. He looked for signs, guilt, nervousness, something that didn't fit. But everyone in Barrow Point looked the same as they always had, tired, weathered, resigned to the rhythms of a town that never changed. By the end of the year, Dole stopped looking. Whatever had happened to Daniel Mercer, it was buried not beneath the silence, beneath the fog, beneath the cold waters of the Atlantic. In 1991, a new English teacher arrived at Barrow Point Higher, young man fresh out of college, eager and optimistic. He was assigned Mercer's old classroom, which had been repainted over the summer. The walls were a pale, institutional beige. The bookshelves had been cleared. There was nothing left of the man who had taught there for 11 years. The new teacher asked Principal Cross about his predecessor. She told him only that Mercer had been an excellent educator, who had met with an unfortunate accident. The conversation ended there. By 1992, most of the students who had known Mercer had graduated or moved away. The town's memory of him became softer, vaguer, a story told in passing, a name mentioned occasionally at town council meetings when budget discussions turned to school safety. Garrett Hines, the jogger who had found Mercer's car at Gull's Head, moved to Portland that year. He told friends he couldn't shake the image of that blue Escort sitting alone in the fog, keys still in the ignition, as if waiting for someone to return. By 1993, Sheriff Arnold Decker retired. He handed over his files to his replacement, a younger officer named Kyle Brennan, who had grown up in a neighboring town and knew nothing of Barrow Point's history. Brennan flipped through the Mercer case file once, noted that it had been closed as a presumed drowning, and filed it away in a cabinet marked Cold Cases Unresolved. It sat there, gathering dust. But not everyone forgot. Anita McLean, the former student who had told police about Mercer's research into the Samuel Briggs disappearance, never stopped thinking about it. She had moved on with her life, married, had a daughter, built a career, but the questions lingered. In 1995, 5 years after Mercer vanished, Anita returned to Barrow Point for the first time since his disappearance. She was visiting her aging parents, who still lived in the same house on Maple Street, where she had grown up. On a grey afternoon in October, she drove out to Gull's Head. The cliffs looked the same. The ocean was dark and restless, the wind sharp and cold. She stood at the edge of the gravel lot where Mercer's car had been found, and tried to imagine what had happened that night. Had he walked to the edge of the cliffs and looked out at the water? Had he been alone? Or had someone been with him? Someone who had made sure he never came back? Anita didn't know. But standing there, with the wind pulling at her coat and the waves crashing far below, she felt the weight of all the unanswered questions pressing down on her. She got back in her car and drove into town. On impulse, she stopped at the Barrow Point Historical Society. Margaret Hale, the director, was still there, older now, her hair fully white, but her memory still sharp. "I remember you," Margaret said, when Anita introduced herself. "You were one of Daniel's students, weren't you? I was such a tragedy. He was a good man." Anita hesitated, then asked, "Do you still have the records he was looking at?" "The ones about Samuel Briggs?" Margaret frowned. "I do, but they're locked in the archive now. After Daniel disappeared, Sheriff Decker asked me to restrict access to those files. He said they were part of an ongoing investigation, but the investigation is closed." "I know, but no one ever told me to unseal them." Anita left the Historical Society with a growing sense of unease. Why would Decker restrict access to files about a disappearance from 30 years earlier? What connection could there possibly be between Samuel Briggs and Daniel Mercer? She didn't have answers, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone in Barrow Point did. The years continued to pass. 1996, 1997, 1998. Daniel Mercer became a name on a memorial plaque in the high school lobby, a footnote in the town's history. New teachers came and went. New students filled the classrooms. The town aged, shrank, adapted. But there were still nights when the fog rolled in thick from the ocean, and people in Barrow Point looked out their windows and thought about the man who had disappeared without a trace. They thought about his empty car at Gull's Head, his cryptic words at Carter's Diner, the box of old clippings hidden in his closet. They thought about the silence that had followed the questions that were never answered, the leads that went nowhere, the way the whole town seemed to close ranks and move on as if nothing had happened. And they wondered, quietly, privately, whether Daniel Mercer had been alone that night, or whether someone in Barrow Point knew exactly what had happened and had chosen all these years to say nothing. By 1999, nearly a decade had passed since Mercer's disappearance. Claire Mercer, his sister, had never returned to Barrow Point. She had tried, once, to get the case reopened, writing letters to the state police, to the district attorney, even to a private investigator in Boston. But without new evidence, there was nothing to investigate. The case remained closed. Claire kept the box of research materials her brother had compiled. She read through the clippings, studied the notes, tried to make sense of the patterns Daniel had seen. But the further she dug, the more questions emerged. Samuel Briggs, the fisherman, had disappeared on August 12, 1964. He had left the harbor in his boat, the asterisk, Grace, an asterisk, just after dawn. The weather was clear, the seas were calm. By nightfall, the boat had been found drifting 3 miles offshore. The engine was off, the nets were empty. Samuel Briggs was gone. At the time, the official explanation was that he had fallen overboard. But according to the newspaper clippings, several people in town had questioned that conclusion. Briggs had been an experienced fisherman. He knew the waters, and there were rumors never confirmed, never fully investigated, that Briggs had been involved in something illegal. Smuggling, some said. Others whispered about debts, about people from out of town who had been seen at the docks in the weeks before his disappearance. But the rumors had faded. The case had been closed, and Samuel Briggs, like Daniel Mercer 26 years later, had simply disappeared into the silence. Claire didn't know what her brother had discovered, but she knew he had believed there was a connection, something buried in the past that still mattered in the present. She kept the box in her attic. She told herself she would return to it someday, when she had time, when the grief wasn't so sharp, but she never did. In the winter of 2000, 10 years after Daniel Mercer vanished, Barrow Point held a small memorial service at the high school. A few former students attended. Linda Ray Porter came, as did Raymond Dole. Sheriff Brennan made a brief appearance, though he had never known Mercer personally. Principal Evelyn Cross gave a short speech. She was older now, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the podium. She spoke about Mercer's dedication to his student, his love of literature, his quiet strength. But she said nothing about the questions that still lingered. Nothing about the missing visitor logs, the sealed archive files, the argument in the gym, the cryptic words at the diner. She said nothing because, like everyone else in Barrow Point, she had learned that some questions were better left unasked. The service ended. People filed out into the cold, and Daniel Mercer's name faded a little more, swallowed by time and silence. But the ocean remembered, and somewhere, buried in the past, the truth was waiting. It was August 2008. 18 years had passed since Daniel Mercer disappeared. Barrow Point had changed in small, inevitable ways. The fishing industry had shrunk. Main Street had more empty storefronts than occupied ones. Young people left for college and didn't come back. The population had dropped below 3,000. The high school, once filled with 400 students, now struggled to maintain half that number. But the ocean remained the same, dark, restless, keeping its secrets. That summer was the driest anyone could remember. By late July, Barrow Point Lake, small freshwater body about 6 miles inland from town, had dropped to its lowest level in decades. The lake sat in a depression surrounded by dense pine forest. It was fed by seasonal streams that, in normal years, kept the water level stable. But after months without rain, those streams had slowed to a trickle. The shoreline receded. Rocks and stumps that had been submerged for years emerged from the mud. The lake became a mirror of cracked earth and exposed roots. On August 14th, a man named Tony Rizzo was walking his dog along the lake's eastern shore. Tony was 62, a retired fisherman who had moved to Barrow Point in the late 90s after his wife died. He kept to himself, lived in a small cabin near the lake, and spent his days fishing, reading, and walking his aging retriever Duke. That afternoon, the sun was brutal. The air shimmered with heat. Duke wandered ahead, sniffing at the exposed lake bed, and suddenly stopped. He began digging furiously at something half buried in the dried mud. "Duke, leave it," Tony called, but the dog ignored him. Tony walked over, annoyed, ready to pull Duke away from whatever dead fish or rotting log he'd found. But when he looked down, he saw something that made his breath catch. It was a briefcase, old, waterlogged, covered in layers of dried algae and silt. The leather was cracked and peeling. The metal clasps rusted shut. But it was unmistakably a briefcase, the kind a teacher or businessman might carry. Tony stared at it for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone and called the sheriff's office. Sheriff Kyle Brennan arrived at the lake within an hour, accompanied by Deputy Rebecca Holt. Brennan was in his mid-40s now, graying at the temple, carrying the quiet weariness of someone who had spent too many years in a town where nothing much happened until it did. He crouched beside the briefcase, studying. The leather was too degraded to read any markings, but inside the layers of mud, he could see the outline of papers pressed against the sides. "Think it's recent?" Holt asked. "No," Brennan said. "Look at the corrosion on the metal. This has been in the water for years." They photographed the scene, marked the location with GPS, and carefully lifted the briefcase from the mud. It was heavier than Brennan expected. Waterlogged paper, and silt added weight. They placed it in an evidence bag and transported it back to the station. In the evidence room, Brennan and Holt worked carefully to pry open the rusted clasps. They wore gloves, moved slowly, treating the briefcase like a relic from another era, which, in a way, it was. When the clasps finally gave, the briefcase opened with a wet, sucking sound. Inside were papers, dozens of them, pressed together into a solid, waterlogged mass. The ink had bled and faded, but fragments of text were still visible. Photocopied articles, handwritten notes, old photographs, their images ghostly and indistinct. And on the inside of the briefcase lid, embossed in faded gold lettering, were 3 initials, **DFM, Brennan. Felt a chill run through him. Daniel Francis Mercer. The discovery made the front page of the Barrow Point Beacon. The following week, missing teacher's briefcase found after 18 years. The article was short, factual, cautious. Sheriff Brennan had declined to speculate on how the briefcase had ended up in the lake, or what it might mean. He said only that the case was being reviewed, and that forensic analysis of the materials inside was underway. But in Barrow Point, the news spread like wildfire. Linda Ray Porter heard about it from a customer at Carter's Diner. She set down the coffee pot she was holding and stared out the window, her mind racing back to that night in March 1990, the night Mercer had said he was ready to tell the truth. Raymond Dole heard about it at the hardware store. He stood in the aisle, holding a box of nails, and felt the weight of the secret he'd kept for 18 years, pressed down on him again. Anita McLean, now living in Portland with her teenage daughter, saw the article online. She called her mother in Barrow Point and asked if it was true. Her mother confirmed it, her voice quiet, uncertain. "Do they know what was in it?" Anita asked. "Not yet, but they're saying it's his. It has his initials." Anita hung up and sat in silence, staring at the screen. After all these years, Daniel Mercer's story was rising back to the surface. At the sheriff's office, Brennan and a forensic specialist from the state police worked for days to carefully separate the papers inside the briefcase. It was delicate, painstaking work. The pages were fused together by water, algae, and time. Many were illegible, but some, the ones that had been protected by layers of other documents, were still readable. What they found was a puzzle. Newspaper clippings about Samuel Briggs, the fisherman who had disappeared in 1964. Police reports from that era, photocopied and annotated in Mercer's handwriting. Photographs of boats, docks, men in work clothes, standing on weathered piers, and notes. Pages and pages of notes, written in Mercer's small, precise script. One page, partially legible, read, *SB, didn't fall. Boat was clean, no signs of struggle. Someone brought it back. Why? Who? Another fragment. *3 men at dock the night before. Witnesses saw them. But no one would give names. Why the silence? And near the bottom of the stack, on a page that had been folded and refolded, as if Mercer had carried it with him often, was a single sentence written in red ink. If I'm right, someone in this town has been lying for 26 years. Brennan read the line 3 times. Then he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. Daniel Mercer hadn't gone to Gull's Head to think, or to walk, or to look at the ocean. He had gone there because he had discovered something someone didn't want him to know. Brennan reopened the case officially on August 22, 2008. He began by re-interviewing everyone who had been questioned in 1990. Linda Ray Porter told him again about Mercer's final words at the diner. Raymond Dole repeated his account of the argument in the gym. Anita McLean drove up from Portland and confirmed that Mercer had been researching the Samuel Briggs disappearance. But there was one person Brennan wanted to talk to, who hadn't been interviewed back in 1990. Margaret Hale, the director of the Barrow Point Historical Society. Margaret was in her late 70s now, frail and soft-spoken, but her memory was still sharp. Brennan met with her in the small, cluttered office at the back of the Historical Society building. "I remember Daniel," she said. "He came here several times that winter. He was looking into Samuel Briggs. Do you remember what specifically he was looking for? He wanted to know who was at the docks the night before Samuel disappeared. He asked if there were any record ship, manifests, crew logs, that sort of thing. I told him we had some materials in the archive, but they weren't well organized. Did he find anything?" Margaret hesitated. "I don't know. But after his second visit, Sheriff Decker came to see me. He asked me to restrict access to those files. He said it was part of an ongoing investigation into Mercer's disappearance. That's what I assumed, but he never explained, and I never asked." Brennan made a note. "Do you still have those files?" "I do. They've been locked away all these years. I'd like to see them." Margaret led him to a storage room at the back of the building. The air smelled of old paper and mildew. She unlocked a filing cabinet and pulled out a cardboard box labeled *Maritime Record, 1960 to 1970, *. Brennan carried the box back to his office and spent the next 2 days going through it. What he found changed everything. The records were fragmentary handwritten logs, faded receipts, scattered notes from the harbormaster's office. But buried in the stack was a single page that made Brennan stop cold. It was a crew manifest from August 11, 1964, the day before Samuel Briggs disappeared. The manifest listed the crew of a cargo vessel called the Northern Star *, which had docked in Barrow Point for repairs. 3 names were listed: Eugene Calloway, *, Brennan stared at the third name. Arthur Cross, Evelyn Cross, the principal of Barrow Point High, had been married to a man named Arthur Cross. He had died in 1997, but Brennan remembered hearing about him. He'd been a merchant seaman in his younger years, retired to Barrow Point in the early 80s. Brennan cross-referenced the name with Old Town records. Arthur Cross had indeed lived in Barrow Point, and according to a 1990 property deed, he and Evelyn had been living together at the time of Daniel Mercer's disappearance. Brennan felt the pieces clicking into place. Mercer had been investigating Samuel Briggs. He had discovered that 3 men from the Northern Star were in Barrow Point the night before Briggs vanished. One of those men was Arthur Croster, husband of his own principal. And then Mercer had disappeared. Brennan scheduled an interview with Evelyn Cross for August 28th. She was retired now, living alone in a small house on Cedar Street. Brennan arrived at 10 in the morning, accompanied by Deputy Holt. Evelyn answered the door slowly. She looked older, smaller than Brennan remembered, her silver hair thinner, her hands trembling slightly. She invited them in and offered tea, which they declined. "I assume this is about Daniel Mercer," she said, settling into an armchair. "It is. We've reopened the case." Evelyn nodded, her expression unreadable. "I heard about the briefcase. Mrs. Cross, I need to ask you about your late husband Arthur." A flicker of something fear. Resignation crossed her face. What about him? He was a merchant seaman. He was in Barrow Point in August 1964. The same time, a fisherman named Samuel Briggs disappeared. Evelyn's hands tightened on the armrests of her chair. "That was a long time ago." "Yes, it was. But I believe Daniel Mercer discovered a connection between your husband and Samuel Briggs. I believe that's what he was investigating when he disappeared." Evelyn said nothing. She stared at her hands, her jaw set. "Mrs. Cross," Brennan said gently, "if you know anything now is the time to tell me." For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, quietly, Evelyn spoke. "My husband never told me what happened that night, but I knew something had. He came home late, agitated, wouldn't talk about it. And a few days later, Samuel Briggs was missing. Arthur changed after that. He drank more. He had nightmares. But he never said a word." "Did Daniel Mercer confront you about this?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "No. But I knew he was asking questions. I saw him at the Historical Society. I heard about the files he was looking at. And I was afraid of what he might find. Afraid of what it would mean for Arthur, for me, for this town. Did you tell anyone?" Evelyn looked up at Brennan, her face pale. "I told Arthur. The night before Daniel disappeared, I told him that the teacher was asking questions about 1964. Arthur got very quiet. He said he would take care of it." Brennan felt his pulse quicken. What did he mean by that? "I don't know. I swear I don't." The next day, Daniel was missing, and Arthur. He never spoke about it again. The interview ended. Brennan thanked Evelyn and left, his mind racing. Arthur Cross was dead. He couldn't be questioned, couldn't be charged, but the pieces were coming together. Mercer had discovered that Arthur Cross was connected to Samuel Briggs' disappearance. He had planned to confront someone or to reveal what he'd found. But before he could, he vanished. Brennan reviewed the evidence again. The briefcase had been found in Barrow Point Lake, 6 miles from Gull's Head. Why the lake? How had it gotten there? And then Brennan remembered something. In 1990, Arthur Cross had owned a small fishing cabin on the north shore of Barrow Point Lake. The cabin sat at the edge of the lake, half hidden by overgrown pines and tangled brush. It had been abandoned for years. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging in places, the whole structure leaning slightly to one side, as if the weight of time had become too much to bear. Sheriff Brennan stood in the clearing in front of it, studying the building. According to property records, Arthur Cross had purchased the cabin in 1978 and kept it until his death in 1997. After that, it had passed to Evelyn, who had never used it. Eventually, she'd stopped paying taxes on the property, and it had reverted to the town. No one had been inside in over a decade. Brennan had brought Deputy Holt and a forensic team from the state police. They arrived on the morning of September 2nd, 2008, carrying equipment, cameras, and evidence bags. The air was cool and damp, the lake still low from the drought, its exposed bed cracked and pale in the morning light. "What are we looking for?" Holt asked. "Anything," Brennan said. "Anything that connects this place to Daniel Mercer." They pried the boards off the front door and stepped inside. The interior smelled of rot and mildew. Dust hung thick in the air, illuminated by narrow beams of light filtering through gaps in the boarded windows. The furniture was old and decayed, a sagging couch, a wooden table with one broken leg, a metal-framed bed with a stained mattress. The forensic team moved methodically through the cabin, photographing everything, checking for prints, fibers, anything that might yield evidence. Brennan walked slowly through the rooms, his flashlight sweeping across walls and floors. In the back corner of the main room, near the small kitchen area, he noticed something. The floorboards were uneven. One section looked newer than the rest, the wood a slightly different shade. "Halt," he called. "Come here." She crossed the room and knelt beside him. Together, they pried up the loose boards. Beneath them was a shallow space, about 2 feet deep. It was empty, but the walls of the cavity were lined with old newspapers, yellowed and brittle. Brennan carefully lifted one out and unfolded it. It was a page from Asterisk, the Barrow Point Beacon, Asterisk, dated March 7, 1993, days after Daniel Mercer disappeared. The headline read, Asterisk, search for missing teacher continued. Asterisk, Brennan's pulse quickened. He looked at Holt. This was a hiding place. Someone used this cabin after Mercer vanished. They searched the rest of the cabin more carefully. In a closet near the back, beneath a pile of old blankets, they found a cardboard box. Inside were more newspapers, all from March and April 1990, all related to the search for Daniel Mercer. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in plastic, was a small leather notebook. Brennan opened it carefully. The pages were filled with handwriting, tight, angular, hurried. It wasn't Mercer's handwriting. Brennan recognized it immediately from Old Town records he'd reviewed. It was Arthur Cross's. The notebook was a journal, though it read more like a confession. The entries were sporadic, dated between 1964 and 1990. Brennan sat at a table in the sheriff's office and read through them, page by page, piecing together a story that had been buried for decades. The first entry was dated August 13, 1964. Asterisk, Sam is gone. We didn't mean for it to happen this way. He found out what we were doing, the cargo, the runs we were making. He said he was going to report us. Preston panicked. There was a fight on the dock. Sam went into the water. We couldn't find him. Eugene said we had to leave. We brought his boat back to make it look like an accident. No one saw us. I hope to God no one saw us. Asterisk, Brennan felt the weight of the words. Samuel Briggs hadn't fallen from his boat. He'd been killed an accident, born of panic and desperation, and 3 men had covered it up. The next several entries were brief, scattered across years. Arthur wrote about guilt, about nightmares, about the silence he and the others had kept. Asterisk, Eugene moved to Boston. Preston died in 72. It's just me now. Sometimes I think I see Sam's face in the water. I can't forget. And then, near the end of the notebook, an entry dated March 3, 1990. Asterisk, Evelyn told me tonight that the teacher, Mercer, has been asking questions. He's been looking into Sam's disappearance. He's been at the Historical Society, going through old records. He knows something. Evelyn is scared. She thinks it will come back to me. I told her I would take care of it. Brennan's hands tightened on the notebook. The next entry was dated March 5, 1990, the day after Mercer disappeared. Asterisk, I didn't plan it this way. I only wanted to talk to him, to explain, to make him understand that it was an accident, that it happened so long ago. I called him Saturday night and told him I needed to see him. He agreed to meet me at Gull's Head. I thought I could convince him to let it go, but when I got there, he was angry. He said people deserved to know the truth. He said Sam's family deserved answers. He wouldn't listen. We argued. He turned to walk away. I grabbed his arm. He pulled back. And then he fell. Asterisk, Brennan read the passage 3 times, his breath shallow. Asterisk, he fell over the edge. I heard him hit the rocks below. The tide was coming in. I looked down, but I couldn't see him. I panicked. I took his briefcase from the car. It had all his research, all the notes. I drove to the cabin and threw it in the lake. I thought it would sink, that no one would find it. I went back to Gull's Head and left his car there. I wiped down everything I touched. Then I went home. Evelyn was asleep. I never told her what happened. Brennan set the notebook down and stared at the wall. Daniel Mercer had died because he wanted the truth. He had died because he believed that silence was a betrayal of Samuel Briggs, of justice, of history itself. And Arthur Cross, consumed by guilt and fear, had made sure Mercer's voice was silenced. The journal was logged as evidence. Brennan prepared a report for the district attorney, outlining the findings. But there would be no trial. Arthur Cross was dead. Eugene Calloway, the second man on the Asterisk Northern Star Asterisk, had died in 2003. Preston Voss had been dead since 1972. The men responsible for Samuel Briggs' death were gone, and the man responsible for Daniel Mercer's death could never be held accountable. Still, the truth had been found, and that mattered. On September 15, 2008, Sheriff Brennan held a press conference at the Barrow Point Town Hall. Local reporters attended, along with journalists from Portland and Augusta. Brennan stood at a podium, the journal sitting in an evidence bag on the table beside him. He explained what had been discovered: the briefcase, the cabin, the journal. He outlined the connections between Samuel Briggs and Daniel Mercer. He spoke carefully, factually, without embellishment. Daniel Mercer, Brennan said, was investigating a decades-old disappearance. He uncovered evidence suggesting that Samuel Briggs' death in 1964 was not an accident, but the result of a confrontation that was subsequently covered up. When Mercer planned to reveal his findings, he was confronted by one of the men involved. According to a journal found at the scene, Mercer fell to his death during that confrontation. His body was likely swept out to sea by the tide. Brennan paused, then continued. While the individual responsible for Mercer's death is deceased, we now know what happened on the night of March 4, 1990. We have answers, and we owe those answers to the families who have waited 18 years for the truth. The room was silent. Linda Ray Porter watched the press conference on the small television in the back office at Carter's Diner. When it ended, she turned off the TV and sat in the quiet, tears streaming down her face. I'm finally ready to tell the truth about something. Now 18 years later, she understood what Daniel had meant. He had been ready to tell the truth about Samuel Briggs. He had been ready to confront the silence that had swallowed a man's life and left his family without answers, and it had cost him everything. Raymond Dole heard about the findings from a neighbor. He sat in his small apartment, staring out the window at the grey sky, thinking about the argument he'd seen in the gym all those years ago. The man Daniel had been arguing with it must have been Arthur Cross. Dole had seen them, but hadn't recognized Cross in the dim light. He'd told the police about it, but no one had followed up. No one had asked the right questions. For years, Dole had carried the weight of that memory. Now, finally, it had a context. It had a meaning. He didn't know if that made it easier or harder to bear. Anita McLean drove to Barrow Point the day after the press conference. She went to Gull's Head and stood at the edge of the cliffs, looking out at the ocean. The wind was cold, the sky heavy with clouds. Waves crashed against the rocks below, relentless and unchanging. She thought about Daniel, her teacher, her mentor, the man who had encouraged her to ask questions, to think critically, to never accept silence as an answer. He had lived by those principles, and he had died for them. Anita stayed at the cliffs for a long time. Then she got back in her car and drove to the Barrow Point Historical Society. Margaret Hale was there, as always, sorting through old files. She looked up when Anita entered. "I heard about the press conference," Margaret said quietly. "I know," Anita said. "I wanted to ask you something. The files Daniel was looking at, the ones about Samuel Briggs, are they still sealed?" Margaret shook her head. "Not anymore. Sheriff Brennan released them after the investigation concluded." "Can I see them?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded. She led Anita to the back room and unlocked the filing cabinet. Anita spent the next 2 hours reading through the files: ship manifests, crew logs, witness statements from 1964. She read Samuel Briggs' obituary, published in the Beacon on August 20th, 1964. It described him as a devoted husband and father, a skilled fisherman, a man respected in his community. At the bottom of the article was a line that made Anita's throat tighten. He is survived by his wife, Helen, and 2 daughters, Ruth and Eleanor. Samuel Briggs had left behind a family. For decades, they had lived with the official explanation that he had fallen from his boat. They had never known the truth. Anita closed the file and stood. She asked Margaret for the contact information of Briggs' surviving family, if any records still existed. Ruth Briggs had been 8 years old when her father disappeared. She was 62 now, living in a small town in New Hampshire. When Anita called her, Ruth was quiet, cautious. "I saw the news," Ruth said, "about the teacher, about what he found." "Your father didn't fall," Anita said gently. "It wasn't an accident. And Daniel Mercer wanted people to know that. He wanted your family to have the truth." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Ruth spoke, her voice breaking. "Thank you for telling me, for making sure people knew." After the call ended, Anita sat in her car outside the Historical Society and cried, "For Daniel, for Samuel Briggs, for all the people who had carried the weight of silence for far too long." In the weeks that followed, Barrow Point began to process what had been revealed. The Barrow Point Beacon ran a series of articles about the case, about the connections between the two disappearances, about the cost of secrets kept too long. Some people defended Arthur Cross, saying he had been a good man who made a terrible mistake. Others condemned him, saying he had stolen 2 lives and died without ever facing justice. But most people simply felt the weight of it, all the tragedy, the waste, the knowledge that their small town had been shaped by violence and silence, in ways they were only now beginning to understand. On October 4, 2008, 10 years and 7 months after Daniel Mercer disappeared, Barrow Point High held a memorial service in his honor. It was attended by former students, teachers, and townspeople who had known him or been touched by his story. Sheriff Brennan spoke briefly, explaining what Mercer had been trying to do and what his work had ultimately revealed. A plaque was unveiled in the school lobby, next to the one that had been placed years earlier. This one read, Daniel Francis Mercer, 1953 to 1990, a teacher who sought the truth and gave his life for it. His courage reminds us that silence is not peace, and that justice delayed is not justice denied. Linda Ray Porter attended the service. So did Raymond Dole. Anita McLean stood in the back, holding her daughter's hand, watching as students placed white flowers at the base of the plaque. And in that moment, surrounded by the people whose lives Daniel Mercer had touched, they felt something shift. Not closure, exactly, not peace, but something like it. The truth had been found, the silence had been broken, and Daniel Mercer, wherever he was, could finally rest. Years passed. Barrow Point continued to shrink, to age, to change. The fishing industry dwindled further. Young people still left for cities and rarely came back, but the town carried the story of Daniel Mercer with it, woven into its memory. A reminder of what happens when people refuse to speak and what happens when one person refuses to stay silent. In 2015, a documentary filmmaker from Boston came to Barrow Point to research the case. She interviewed Sheriff Brennan, Anita McLean, Linda Ray Porter, and others who had been part of the story. The documentary aired on public television the following year, titled The Teacher and the Fisherman, a story of silence and truth. It won awards. It was shown in classrooms across New England, and it ensured that Daniel Mercer's name and his commitment to uncovering the truth would not be forgotten. Ruth Briggs, Samuel's daughter, watched the documentary from her home in New Hampshire. Afterward, she wrote a letter to Barrow Point High, thanking them for honoring Daniel Mercer's memory. He gave my family something we thought we'd never have. She wrote. He gave us the truth, and for that, I will be forever grateful. On a cold morning in March 2020, 30 years after Daniel Mercer disappeared, a small group gathered at Gull's Head. They stood at the edge of the cliffs, looking out at the grey Atlantic. The wind was sharp, the sky heavy with clouds. Sheriff Brennan was there, retired now, but still carrying the weight of the case. Anita McLean came with her grown daughter. A few of Mercer's former students made the drive from out of state, and Linda Ray Porter, older now and moving slowly, stood at the edge of the group, holding a single white rose. One by one, they spoke about Daniel Mercer. They shared memories of his classes, his kindness, his belief that every person's story mattered. They spoke about the price he had paid for seeking the truth, and the legacy he had left behind. When the last words were spoken, Linda stepped forward and tossed the rose over the edge of the cliff. It fell slowly, spinning in the wind, until it disappeared into the waves below. They stood in silence for a moment. Then, together, they turned and walked back to their cars, leaving the cliffs and the ocean behind. But the memory of Daniel Mercer remained etched into the rocks, carried on the wind, woven into the fabric of a small town that had learned, too late, the cost of silence. Sometimes, late at night, when fog rolls in thick from the Atlantic, and the wind carries the smell of salt and kelp, people in Barrow Point still think about him. They think about the teacher who asked questions no one wanted to answer, the man who believed that truth mattered more than comfort, more than reputation, more than fear. They think about the briefcase that rose from the lake, the journal hidden in the wall, the secrets that finally, after decades, came to light. And they wonder how many other stories are still buried in old cabinets, in forgotten files, in the memories of people too afraid or too ashamed to speak. The ocean keeps its secrets, but sometimes, if you wait long enough, if you refuse to look away, the truth finds its way back. Daniel Mercer knew that, and in the end, his silence spoke louder than any confession ever could. In 2023, Claire Mercer Daniels' sister passed away at the age of 74. In her will, she left a donation to Barrow Point High School to establish a scholarship in her brother's name. The Daniel F. Point Mercer Memorial Scholarship is awarded annually to a graduating senior who demonstrates a commitment to seeking truth, advocating for justice, and giving voice to the voiceless. The first recipient was a young woman named Sophie Chen, who wrote her application essay about the importance of investigative journalism in holding communities accountable. At the award ceremony, she said, "Daniel Mercer taught us that asking questions is not a crime. It's a responsibility." The room stood and applauded. And somewhere, in the cold waters off the coast of Maine, the ocean carried on relentless, eternal, keeping some secrets while surrendering others. But Daniel Mercer's story was no longer one of them.